Welcome, Eyesight's Hidden Revolution. Hey guys, today we are going on a journey, not through distant lands or forgotten battles, but deep into the very heart of human perception. A journey into the hidden revolution that transformed how you interact with the world. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up tomorrow and the crisp edges of your phone's screen are a blurry mess. The words on your favorite book shimmer and dance like mirages on a hot desert road. Your grandmother's face, once a tapestry of loving wrinkles, becomes a watercolor smudge. You try to thread a needle, and it's like trying to thread a camel through the eye of, well, you get the picture. Now, hold that thought. Hold that frustration, that sudden, incapacitating blur. Because for almost all of human history, for countless generations before you, that wasn't a hypothetical thought experiment. It was an inevitable reality. You probably won't survive this, not if this refers to navigating an entire adult life without your precious vision aids. Your fate would have been sealed the moment your eyes, those miraculous, fragile orbs, decided they were done with fine print. We're talking about a world where getting old didn't just mean aching joints and questionable fashion choices. It meant losing your ability to read, to work, to create, to connect with the very fabric of knowledge. It meant a slow, creeping intellectual darkness, long before your actual lights went out. Picture yourself now, not in your comfy bed, but 1,000 years ago. You're a scribe, maybe, hunched over parchment in a flickering monastery. Your fingers are nimble, accustomed to the delicate dance of quill and ink. But as the decades tick by, as your hair grays and your back stiffens, a different kind of fog descends. The meticulously illuminated letters, once so clear, begin to blur. They merge into an illegible squiggly line, a cruel joke played by your own aging lenses. You squint, you strain, you push the heavy manuscript further and further away, hoping distance will somehow magic clarity back into your world. It won't. You try to thread a fine needle for your embroidery or carve a tiny detail into wood, and your once sharp focus deserts you. The world, which used to be a vibrant tapestry, begins to fray at the edges, dissolving into soft, indistinct shapes. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a devastating professional and personal blow. If you were a craftsman relying on precision, your livelihood withered. If you were a scholar, your access to wisdom became a frustrating, almost impossible quest. Imagine a carpenter who suddenly can't see the grain of the wood, or a seamstress who can't find the eye of the needle. They didn't just need a bigger font, they needed a revolution. And that revolution, my friends, was a tiny, unassuming piece of curved glass. For millennia, the solutions to failing eyesight were, well, non-existent. People simply accepted it as an unavoidable part of aging, a natural decline that marked the end of your productive years. You might have heard whispers of ancient Egyptians using water-filled globes to magnify objects, or Seneca the Younger admiring how tiny letters appeared larger through a glass sphere filled with water. These were certainly interesting observations, delightful party tricks perhaps, but they were hardly practical vision correction. You couldn't exactly strap a fishbowl to your face and expect to navigate a bustling medieval marketplace, could you? Though honestly, some of those medieval hats were pretty wild, so who knows? Maybe it was just a fashion faux pas waiting to happen. The mainstream historical fact here is stark. Widespread, accessible vision correction, as we know it, simply did not exist until the late Middle Ages. Before that, anyone suffering from presbyopia, the natural hardening of the eye's lens that makes near vision blurry with age, was simply out of luck. Your world literally shrunk to what you could discern at arm's length. And beyond that, it was all guesswork and blurry outlines. This wasn't just about reading. It was about intricate craft, scientific observation, and even discerning faces in a crowd. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Some historical accounts suggest that medieval monks, particularly those engaged in copying manuscripts, would sometimes suffer from a peculiar ailment known as writer's cramp of the eyes. While not a true medical diagnosis, it vividly describes the agony of eye strain and fatigue from hours of delicate work under poor light. They'd rub their eyes, splash them with water, perhaps even try concoctions of herbs or prayers, but the fundamental problem remained. It's like trying to make your Wi-Fi stronger by restarting your router 50 times a day. Noble effort, but completely misses the point if the real problem is your ancient dial-up connection. Historians still argue whether the widespread inability to read fine print among older individuals significantly hampered the spread of knowledge and innovation in pre-spectacle societies. Did the intellectual life of a community effectively shut down for its most experienced members once their eyes gave out? Were countless potential breakthroughs lost because the very people with the wisdom and time to delve into texts were suddenly barred from doing so? It's a compelling thought, this silent intellectual cap on human potential, imposed not by tyranny or war, but by the relentless march of time across your very own eyeballs. Imagine the sheer frustration. You have years of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and a mind still eager to learn. But your primary interface with the written word, with the detailed work that defines your craft, has betrayed you. You'd have to rely on younger eyes, or simply give up. This isn't just about reading a bedtime story. This is about being a functioning member of society, maintaining your independence, and contributing your accumulated wisdom. The advent of spectacles wasn't just about correcting vision. It was about extending the productive, intellectual life of individuals by decades. It was about allowing the wise to remain wise, the skilled to remain skilled, and the curious to remain curious, even as their biological clocks ticked away. And this quiet revolution, born of necessity and ingenuity, was about to fundamentally reshape not just how people saw, but how they thought, learned, and lived. You are standing on the precipice of that transformation right now, feeling the very real, very frustrating, and very historical struggle of humanity against the blur. Ancient blurs, life without lenses. Imagine struggling with nearsightedness in a pre-spectacle world. You wake with the familiar, maddening haze, the world a softened watercolor painting where details smudge into frustrating approximations. The vibrant tapestries of the marketplace become a confusing swirl of colors. Faces blend into indistinguishable forms, and the intricate patterns on the pottery you meticulously craft vanish into a frustrating blur, a mere arm's length away. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a profound disability, a daily battle against a world that demands precision and clarity. Your survival, in fact, hinges on it. Forget trying to read ancient scrolls or sew a fine tunic. You probably wouldn't last long trying to identify a foraging berry from its poisonous look-alike, let alone spotting a predator before it spots you. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be a rabbit, or, more likely, something that views you as dinner. You navigate by memory, by sound, by the general shape of things, but the sharp edges of reality remain elusive. In a world without corrective lenses, vision problems weren't just a personal handicap. They often dictated your destiny. If your eyes failed you, your ability to contribute, to survive independently, dwindled rapidly. There were no opticians, no quick fixes, no just pop on your reading glasses. Your future, Whether as a hunter, a scribe, or a weaver was determined by the sharpness of your natural sight. Consider the craftsperson. You dedicate your life to mastering the intricate details of jewelry making, carving, or painting. But as your eyes betray you, the tiny etchings blur, the fine lines become impossible to discern. Your hands remember the motions, but without the visual feedback, your work becomes crude, your livelihood threatened. Or the scribe, painstakingly copying texts by flickering oil lamp. Their work demanded unparalleled visual acuity, day in and day out. A single missed character, a blurred word, could change the meaning of an entire legal decree or sacred scripture. Imagine the pressure, the constant strain, the slow, inevitable decline into illegibility. For most people, the world simply got blurrier with age, and that was just life. The wisdom of elders might have been revered, but their decreasing ability to see the world clearly often pushed them to the margins, dependent on younger, sharper eyes. Society adapted, or rather simply accepted, this visual decline as an immutable fact of human existence, like the graying of hair or the slowing of gait. There was no medical understanding of refractive errors. No concept that a simple curved piece of glass could bring the world back into focus. It was a failing of the body, a natural decay, or perhaps even a subtle punishment from the gods. "Oh, poor old Thuron, his eyes are like mud now," they'd say, shaking their heads with pity, never with a thought of a solution. Of course, the ancients weren't entirely without curiosity regarding optics. You might have heard whispers of extraordinary natural crystals, like the so-called Nimrud lens, a piece of rock crystal from ancient Assyria, dating back nearly 3 millennia. It could magnify, yes, but whether it was truly used as a reading aid or just a decorative piece, or perhaps a tool for starting fires, remains a lively academic debate. Historians still argue whether these ancient artifacts were optical tools or merely curiosities. It certainly wasn't handed out by an ancient equivalent of Specsavers. And then there's the more practical, yet still incredibly rudimentary, observation by the Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger, who noted that letters, however small and indistinct, are seen enlarged and more clearly through a globe of glass filled with water. A globe of water. Imagine trying to read your epic poem by holding a giant, sloshing fishbowl up to your face. It might have helped, perhaps, but it certainly wasn't portable, discreet, or convenient. You'd look less like a scholar, and more like a very thirsty, slightly confused goldfish. Even with these early, fleeting glimpses into magnification, the concept of specifically ground lenses to correct individual vision defects was utterly foreign. It just didn't exist. People squinted, stumbled, and eventually resigned themselves to a blurry existence. The idea that a piece of glass could compensate for nature's cruel lottery was as alien as flying to the moon. Your eye problems were your problems, an inherent flaw in your personal machinery, not something that could be externalized and corrected. The focus was on preserving what little sight you had, with concoctions and remedies that today would make you wince, anything from powdered snake skin to dried frog eyes, applied with earnest belief, but utterly no scientific basis. You'd likely get a nasty infection before you ever saw sharper. The entire visual landscape of ancient life was thus fundamentally different, muted and indistinct for a significant portion of its population, especially as they aged. The revolution of clear sight, the very notion of reading glasses, was still centuries away, hidden in the unformed future, waiting for the right mind, the right conditions to bring it blinking into existence. You lean in closer, your eyes aching. a faint tremor running through your hand as you try to thread a needle no thicker than a spider's silk. The candlelight flickers, casting dancing shadows that make your task even more impossible. You squint, your brow furrowed, the fine linen a frustrating blur just inches from your nose. This isn't just about finishing your sewing for the evening, you understand. This is about survival. If you can't mend that tear, the cold will seep in. If you can't distinguish the faint marks on that clay tablet, the message will be lost. And let's be honest, in this pre-spectacle world, if your vision starts to fade before your time, you're pretty much toast. You probably won't survive this. Your utility to the tribe, your ability to provide, all plummet with your clarity of sight. It's a harsh reality, one that drove humanity, slowly but surely, to seek anything to sharpen the world. So how did we get from that agonizing blur to the crisp clarity of today? Well, our earliest ancestors didn't just throw up their hands in surrender. They experimented. They noticed things. Imagine a small, perfectly rounded droplet of morning dew clinging to a leaf, distorting and enlarging the tiny veins beneath it. Or picture a smooth, polished pebble, wet from a stream, catching the light and making a speck of dust appear curiously massive. These weren't tools, not yet, but they were observations. They were the genesis of an idea that would ripple through millennia. The first clumsy attempts at visual enhancement weren't the sleek, perfectly ground lenses, you know. No, they were far more organic, far more watery. Think about a Roman scholar, perhaps Pliny the Elder, hunkered over a scroll. He might have placed a large, clear glass globe, perfectly spherical and filled with water, directly onto the papyrus. As the light passed through the water-filled sphere, it bent, it refracted. And voila! The letters, previously a squiggly mess for his aging eyes, would appear ever so slightly larger, crisper. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The image would be distorted at the edges, perhaps a little wobbly, like trying to read through a fishbowl after a particularly wild party. But for someone whose livelihood depended on interpreting those tiny symbols, it was a revelation. Pliny himself, a man whose curiosity knew no bounds, actually mentioned in his Natural History that physicians of his era used such globes filled with water to cauterize wounds, focusing the sun's rays to burn tissue. It's a mainstream historical fact that these weren't just theoretical curiosities. They had practical applications, even if they weren't strictly for reading. He also noted that hollow glass balls, when filled with water, proved to be equally serviceable for enlarging objects, suggesting their use for magnification was known, even if not widely adopted by the general populace for reading. But water globes had their limitations. They were fragile, messy if dropped, and frankly, a bit of a pain to carry around. So humanity looked to the earth itself. Enter the world of polished gems and volcanic glass. You see, long before we figured out how to melt sand into clear sheets, nature offered its own solutions. Obsidian, that dark, glassy rock formed from rapidly cooled lava, could be flaked and polished to a smooth, almost mirror-like surface. And while its primary use was for cutting tools, some larger, flatter pieces, when observed carefully, could offer a very slight magnification. It was less about deliberate shaping into a lens and more about finding naturally occurring curvatures that bent light in a helpful way. Then there were the crystals. Quartz, beryl, rock crystal, these translucent beauties, when found in large enough chunks and polished painstakingly, could serve as primitive magnifiers. Imagine a Roman emperor, perhaps Nero, supposedly using an emerald to watch gladiator games. Now, historians still argue whether he was using it as a corrective lens for his short-sightedness. or simply as a tinted filter to reduce glare, or even as a symbolic gesture of wealth. But the very idea that a precious stone could enhance vision, even in a primitive way, captivated the ancient mind. The Romans, with their obsession with precision and engineering, were known to polish various stones. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the so-called Nimrud lens, an ancient artifact dating back to the 7th century BC, unearthed in modern-day Iraq. This piece of rock crystal, roughly oval-shaped and plano-convex, flat on one side, curved on the other, has long been debated. Some scholars argue it's merely a decorative piece, a jewel. Others vehemently claim it's the oldest known magnifying lens, capable of magnifying images by about 3 times. Was it used by Assyrian scribes to read their cuneiform tablets, or perhaps by jewelers for intricate work? The truth is, we don't know for sure, and that's precisely where the fun lies. Historians still argue whether the Nimrud lens was indeed a deliberate optical instrument, or merely an accidental byproduct of gem polishing. It's like finding an ancient smartphone and wondering if it was used for calls, or just as a fancy paperweight. These early magnifiers, whether water-filled globes or polished gems, were not spectacles in the sense we understand them. They weren't worn, nor were they consistently shaped for optimal light refraction. They were more like glorified paperweights that happened to make things look bigger. The process of using them was cumbersome. You had to hold the object and the magnifier just right, aligning everything perfectly, chasing the elusive sweet spot of clarity. It required patience, good light, and a fair bit of trial and error. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation from ancient scribes, trying to decipher a particularly cramped manuscript through a wobbly water globe. It makes you appreciate your modern reading glasses, doesn't it? Just imagine trying to update your social media profile using a cup of water as your screen magnifier. Hilarious, right? Unless you needed to see that tiny little send button, then it would just be tragic. The principle, however, was understood. Light bends when it passes from one medium to another. And if you could control that bending, you could control what the eye perceived. This fundamental concept, gleaned from accidental observations of dewdrops and polished stones, was the first tentative step on a very long journey. It was a journey away from the blurry world of struggle, and towards a future where clarity was not just a luxury, but an expectation. Remember that feeling of frustration when you couldn't quite make out the details from the previous section? These early attempts, however crude, were the first flickers of hope against that encroaching blur. They were humanity's first real attempt to say, no, we will not succumb to fading vision. We will find a way to see. And they did, slowly, painstakingly, one wobbly globe and polished stone at a time. The world was still mostly out of focus for many, but the seeds of a revolution, quite literally, were beginning to crystallize. Italian dawn, Venice's glass secrets. You stand on a rickety wooden bridge, the salty Adriatic breeze whipping your cloak around you, carrying the scent of brine and something else, something alchemical. Smoke plumes against the bruised dawn sky, not from cooking fires, but from furnaces roaring with an infernal hunger. This is Venice, 13th century, a city built on water and ambition, where fortunes are forged not from steel but from sand. You squint, trying to make out the distant silhouettes of gondolas, but the morning mist and perhaps your own aging eyes blur the details. Remember those precious gems and water globes we talked about, mere curiosities for the very rich. Well, here, in this labyrinth of canals and whispers, something truly revolutionary is bubbling in crucibles hotter than dragon's breath. If you were living right now in this bustling, vibrant city and your eyesight was failing, you'd be functionally blind by 50. Forget reading maps, counting coins, or even recognizing faces across the crowded piazza. Your days as a scribe, a merchant, a scholar, poof, gone. You probably wouldn't survive this era for long if your livelihood depended on sharp vision. It's a stark reality, one that drove brilliant minds, or perhaps just desperate ones, to tinker. They're not just blowing pretty baubles here, they're chasing clarity. You feel the ground vibrate slightly underfoot, a testament to the colossal energy expended in the glass furnaces on the island of Murano. By now, the Venetian Republic has shrewdly consolidated its glass-making industry there, not just for safety. Those furnaces could ignite half the city in a blink. Imagine the insurance premiums. But primarily to guard their most precious commodity, trade secrets. These glass masters, the maestri vetri, they aren't just artisans. They're like alchemists, turning common silica into shimmering, versatile magic. You see them, sweat-streaked, muscles bulging, coaxing molten glass into forms of exquisite beauty chalices, flasks, vibrant mosaics that adorn the grandest cathedrals across Europe. But their ultimate quest isn't merely beauty, it's utility. It's a mainstream historical fact that by the late 13th century, Venice, specifically Murano, was the undisputed center of fine glass production in Europe. They had perfected techniques for making clear, colorless glass cristallo, a crucial prerequisite for lenses. This was no small feat. Earlier glass was often cloudy, tinged with impurities. The Venetians, through painstaking experimentation and guarding their secrets with almost paranoid fervor, cracked the code. A quirky tidbit. The Venetian government went to extreme lengths to prevent glassmakers from leaving Murano and taking their knowledge with them. They were granted privileges, yes, but also subjected to severe penalties, including execution, if they attempted to emigrate and share their craft with rivals. It was a gilded cage, designed to keep their golden geese precisely where they were. Imagine trying to explain that to your kids. No, honey, you can't go to France to blow glass. You'll lose your head. Stick to making those lovely little Murano glass animals. So, amidst this intense secrecy and industrial might, the whispers began. Not of beautiful goblets, but of reading stones, lenses convex enough to magnify text. These weren't spectacles as you know them, not yet. They were literally polished pieces of glass, perhaps half-spheres, that you'd lay directly onto a manuscript. Imagine the monks, their eyes failing from years poring over illuminated texts in dim monasteries, suddenly finding reprieve. The pain in their temples, the blurred words, the exhaustion, eased by a simple piece of glass. It must have felt like a miracle. You can almost hear their sighs of relief. The demand must have been immediate, overwhelming. Historians still argue whether the exact inventor of wearable spectacles was a specific individual like Salvino Darmate or Alessandro della Spina, or if it was a more gradual, collaborative development among anonymous Muranese craftsmen. The evidence is frustratingly murky, often relying on posthumous accounts or epitaphs that might be more wishful thinking than concrete fact. It's a bit like trying to figure out who invented the perfectly toasted marshmallow. Everyone claims it, but no one has the original patent. Whoever it was, they kept it quiet, likely because the commercial advantage was immense. You wouldn't want to broadcast your secret sauce if you were cooking up a whole new industry, would you? The leap from a reading stone to a pair of spectacles that you could wear, freeing your hands, was monumental. It wasn't just about grinding glass, it was about engineering. How do you hold two lenses in front of someone's eyes? comfortably and stably. Early designs were crude. Two lenses perhaps riveted together at the bridge, or held in place by leather or bone frames that pinched your nose, leaving a permanent red mark. Not exactly haute couture. You'd probably look like a startled owl with these contraptions perched precariously on your face. But they worked. And the ability to extend one's productive life, to continue reading, writing, and engaging with the world long after natural eyesight began to dim, was an economic and intellectual game-changer. Imagine the sheer glee of a merchant who can still scrutinize ledgers into his 60s, or a scholar who doesn't have to retire from his beloved books. The glass masters of Murano had inadvertently stumbled upon a fountain of youth for the eyes. They were selling clarity, precision, and an extension of life's most vital pleasures. The demand was insatiable. From the cloistered scriptoriums of Italy to the bustling merchant houses of Flanders, everyone who relied on their eyes for their livelihood or their leisure desperately wanted a pair. And Venice, with its closely guarded glass secrets, was the only place to get them. The sheer ingenuity, the careful manipulation of fire and sand, the years of trial and error in those hot, smoky workshops, it all coalesced here, in the heart of the Venetian Republic. You can almost feel the hum of innovation, the quiet revolution brewing beneath the surface of this glittering, secretive city. It's a story of vision, quite literally, and how one small, clear piece of glass would soon illuminate the entire world. Imagine yourself, hunched over a flickering tallow candle in some dim Florentine scriptorium. The scratch of a quill on parchment the only sound besides your own heavy breathing. Your eyes already strained from years of illuminating manuscripts, copying ancient texts and deciphering faint ink ache. The words on the vellum, even with the strongest light you can muster, blur at the edges, swim together. You squint, you rub, you sigh, but the blur persists. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a career ender, a life diminisher. This is the late 13th century, remember? And if your eyes fail, your livelihood, your ability to read and learn and create, might as well fail too. The path from clear vision to a world of perpetual smudges is a cruel and inevitable one for many. And in a world without vision correction, your intellectual pursuits, your very ability to stay relevant in a burgeoning literate society, would slowly but surely dim, eventually winking out. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this career path, not for long anyway. Yet, amidst this universal visual struggle, whispers begin to circulate. Not from Venice, the glass-making capital we explored, but from Florence, its artistic and intellectual rival. Whispers of a miracle, a device, a man, his name, Salvino Darmate. Now Darmate is a fascinating figure because the evidence for his invention is, well, it's a bit like trying to pin down a particularly elusive ghost at a medieval seance. The primary claim for his pioneering genius largely rests on a posthumous inscription on his tomb in Florence, which, centuries after his death, declared him the inventor of spectacles. Here lies Salvino Darmate, inventor of spectacles, God pardon him, or words to that effect. Sounds pretty definitive, doesn't it? A tombstone doesn't lie, usually. But here's the rub. That inscription only appeared much later in the 17th century, placed there by an admirer who was, let's say, very enthusiastic about Florentine ingenuity. It was a retrospective declaration, possibly based on a misunderstanding, or, more charitably, a well-intentioned but ultimately unprovable family tradition. Imagine someone today putting up a plaque for their great-great-great-grandparents saying they invented the internet, based on a fuzzy family legend. You'd probably raise an eyebrow, wouldn't you? And just like that, Darmate's claim, despite its stone-etched certainty, remains shrouded in doubt, a tantalizing what-if in the history of innovation. Then you have the other major contender, a humble Dominican friar named Alessandro della Spina from Pisa, just a short trudge from Florence. His claim is different, less about direct invention and more about an incredible, almost uncanny, aptitude. The historical record for Spina comes from a contemporary, Friar Giordano de Rivolto, who, in a sermon delivered in 1306, spoke of a man he knew who could make anything he saw. Rivolto specifically stated, and this is crucial, "It is not 20 years since there was found the art of making spectacles, and this is a thing of the greatest utility for the world. I saw the man who first invented and made them, and I talked with him." He goes on to say that this man, generally believed to be Spina, wouldn't share the secret of his craft. The exact quote about Spina emphasizes that he himself knew how to make everything that he saw or heard of being made, but he didn't want to show others how to do it. This implies that Spina either replicated or perhaps independently reinvented them after seeing an example, rather than being the absolute first inventor from scratch. It's a subtle distinction, but a crucial one for history's sake. It's like discovering someone invented the fidget spinner, and then you just make your own, but better, and refuse to share the blueprint. Annoying, but not exactly the original eureka moment, is it? So here we are, caught in a medieval game of whodunit. A historical whodunit without clear fingerprints. Historians still argue whether Salvino Darmate was a genuine innovator, whose credit was lost to the swirling currents of time and poorly kept records, or simply the beneficiary of a later, well-intentioned but ultimately inaccurate attribution. While Alessandro della Spina might have been an early adopter and master craftsman rather than the sole progenitor of these visionating wonders. It's a classic chicken or egg scenario, but with more smudged parchment and fewer actual chickens involved. The truth, like many things in the murky annals of pre-printing press history, remains tantalizingly out of reach, a faint smudge on the lens of time itself. What is clear, what is undeniably true amidst this fog of claims and counterclaims, is that by the late 13th century, specifically between 1286 and 1290, spectacles as we understand them, two convex lenses, joined by a rivet held before the eyes, materialized into existence in northern Italy. This isn't just some fringe theory, it's a widely accepted historical fact. The precise year, the exact individual, that's where the fun and the arguments really begin. It wasn't a slow, incremental evolution from those clumsy water globes and polished gems we talked about earlier. It was a relatively sudden leap, a discrete invention that then spread with surprising speed. Think of it as the original tech disruptor, but without the annoying venture capitalists and endless pitch decks. And for a quirky little tidbit, one of the earliest pieces of undeniable visual evidence for spectacles isn't a detailed blueprint or a glowing advertisement, but a fresco. Yes, a painting. In 1352, Tommaso da Modena, a meticulous Italian artist, painted a series of portraits of cardinals and friars, and one of them, Hugh de Provence, is depicted unmistakably wearing spectacles, perched on his nose, deep in study. This painting, created just decades after the alleged invention, serves as a silent, colorful witness to their existence and practical use. It's like finding a cave painting of someone using a smartphone, proof positive that the technology, however crude, was in play. The friar in the painting looks remarkably unimpressed, almost as if he's thinking, "Oh, these again? Can't read without 'em, can't read with 'em for too long, they keep sliding down." The struggles of early adopters, eh? This visual confirmation, however, settled at least one part of the puzzle. Spectacles were very much a real, working innovation, even if their precise origin remained a point of scholarly contention. You shiver, pulling the coarse wool cowl tighter around your ears, even though you're indoors. It's early, still hours before dawn, and the monastic scriptorium is a symphony of hushed discomfort. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment, beeswax, and damp stone, carrying a faint, lingering aroma that might just be the despair of 1,000 monks who have lost their reading glasses. The only light comes from a single, sputtering tallow lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that make the carefully illuminated text on your desk seem to squirm. You hunch over a massive vellum manuscript, a book of hours, the minuscule Latin script an intricate maze demanding absolute focus. Your quill scratches softly, a tiny sound swallowed by the cavernous silence. You trace each letter, each delicate flourish, your back aching from hours of leaning over the slanted desk. The cold seeps into your bones, but it's the burning behind your eyes that truly distracts you. It started subtly, a slight blur at the edges of the tiny script, then a persistent throbbing in your temples by midday. Now, as the dim light flickers, the words seem to swim before you, merging into an indecipherable gray mass. You rub your eyes hard, feeling the grit of exhaustion, but it does little good. You squint, bringing the page closer, then pushing it away. If you could just get the words to snap into focus, just for a moment. This isn't a leisurely read, mind you. This is your life's work, and the very act of preserving knowledge is slowly, painfully, eroding your ability to see it. Honestly, without modern optometrists and prescription lenses, you probably won't survive this monastic life with your vision intact. You'd be blind by 50 if you were lucky. Your vision, once crisp and reliable, is now a traitorous blur, mocking your efforts with every strained attempt to discern a particularly tiny E from an equally tiny C. It's enough to make you want to throw your inkwell at the wall, but that would violate several monastic rules and probably cost you a week of extra penance, which you also wouldn't be able to read. This wasn't just your problem, though, tucked away in some drafty corner of a medieval monastery. This was a systemic crisis for the intellectual heart of Europe. You see, monasteries during the Middle Ages weren't just places of prayer and quiet contemplation. They were, in a very real sense, the universities, the libraries, and the publishing houses of their time. They were the primary custodians of knowledge, diligently copying and preserving ancient texts, from theological treatises to classical Greek philosophy, from medical texts to agricultural manuals. Without these indefatigable copyists, entire swathes of human wisdom would have simply vanished into the mists of time. They literally kept the light of learning from flickering out during what we now, rather dramatically, call the Dark Ages. But here's the rub. The vast majority of these scribes, these tireless knowledge preservers, were men and some women of mature years. Young novices might start the work, but the true masters of the quill, the ones trusted with the most intricate illuminations and the most critical texts, were often older monks whose hands were steady, but whose eyes were decidedly not. Presbyopia, that delightful age-related farsightedness that makes reading a newspaper without glasses feel like trying to decipher alien hieroglyphs, was a universal affliction. Imagine a factory full of highly skilled workers, whose primary tool is their vision, slowly but inevitably losing the ability to perform their job. The output would plummet, the quality would degrade, and the entire enterprise would grind to a halt. It was a production bottleneck of epic proportions, an insidious enemy of literacy and scholarship, one tiny blur at a time. The monks likely resorted to all sorts of desperate measures, some of which sound vaguely familiar, like pushing the parchment further away, then closer again, then away again, convinced that if they just found the perfect distance, the words would magically pop into focus. Spoiler, they didn't. You probably tried tilting the page, too, hoping a different angle would somehow trick your eyes into clarity. Perhaps you even resorted to a large, clear crystal, like those water globes and polished gems we talked about earlier, to magnify the text. A fringe tidbit here. Some scribes would actually cut back their working hours dramatically in their later years, only tackling the most rudimentary tasks, simply because their vision had deteriorated too much for fine work. Or they would rely heavily on younger monks to read aloud, turning the scriptorium into a peculiar sort of audiobook factory. The sheer resignation to failing sight, the acceptance that your life's calling would literally blind you, must have been soul-crushing. Historians still argue whether the demand for better vision aids from these beleaguered scribes was the primary driving force behind the invention of spectacles, or if it was merely a happy coincidence of Venetian glassmaking innovation. Whatever the impetus, the sheer human need, the deep-seated yearning for clarity in a world suddenly gone blurry, was palpable. It was a silent plea echoing through every monastery, every university, every dusty library, waiting for some unknown genius to finally invent a proper solution that didn't involve holding a heavy crystal sphere over your page all day. You remember those early magnifiers, right? Not exactly hands-free convenience for a busy scribe. They needed something better, something truly revolutionary, something that would bring the world, and more importantly, the sacred texts, back into crystal-clear focus. Murano's magic, guilds, and innovation. The protected secrets of Venetian glassmakers shaping optical history. You step off the gondola, or maybe a slightly less romantic and more pungent ferry, onto the sun-drenched island of Murano. The air here isn't just salty, it's thick with the metallic tang of something hot, something being forged. You can practically taste the silica and the lime, a ghostly residue of centuries of relentless heat. This isn't your average Venetian postcard. This is the heart of an industrial empire, cloaked in beauty and bound by secrets. Imagine the Venetian Republic, a powerhouse of trade and innovation, deciding that its most precious commodity, its glass, needed its own maximum security island. Because, let's be honest, in the medieval world, if you wanted to keep a secret, you didn't just put it in a vault. You put it on an island, surrounded by water and guarded by very serious men with very sharp swords. Trying to sneak out a glass-making technique from Murano. You probably won't survive this. And if you did, good luck trying to replicate that specific Muranese sand, that precise furnace temperature, or the centuries of inherited skill. The furnaces, you see them flickering, great gaping mouths of fire that belch heat even on a cool day, were moved here from Venice in 1291. Officially, it was about fire safety. Venice was mostly wood, and glass furnaces were basically giant, perpetually hungry dragons. Unofficially and far more effectively, it was about control. On Murano, every grain of sand, every lump of potash, every whisper of a technique was under the watchful eye of the Republic. The glassmakers themselves, while highly respected and incredibly wealthy, were essentially prisoners of their trade. They lived lavish lives. Their daughters could marry into Venetian nobility, a rare privilege for non-aristocrats. But leaving the island, and more importantly, revealing their techniques, was punishable by death. Not a gentle go-to-jail death, but a swift, public, and very final one. It was the ultimate non-compete clause, inked in blood. You wander past workshops where men, sweat slicking their faces, twist molten glass like taffy, shaping it into delicate chalices, shimmering beads, and crucially for us, tiny, perfect domes. These aren't just artisans. They are masters of a secret art, members of powerful guilds that dictated every aspect of glass production, from apprenticeship to product quality. These guilds weren't just about setting prices. They were guardians of knowledge, ensuring that the magic of Murano remained exactly that, magic, inaccessible to outsiders. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a top-secret tech company, except their code was a closely guarded mix of chemistry, physics, and sheer, raw talent. If Apple had existed in 13th century Venice, they would have been fighting tooth and nail for Murano's glass. Now, remember those weary scribes we talked about, squinting over illuminated manuscripts, their eyes failing long before their minds. And remember those clumsy early magnifiers, the water globes and polished gems. Murano, with its unique blend of secrecy and obsessive refinement, was the perfect crucible for the next step. Here, the focus wasn't just on making any glass, but perfect glass. Glass that was clearer, purer, and capable of being precisely shaped into convex lenses that could actually sharpen a blurred world. This wasn't an overnight revelation, mind you. It was centuries of incremental improvements, driven by demand, secrecy, and a healthy dose of professional pride. The mainstream historical fact here is undeniable. Venice, and specifically Murano, held a near monopoly on high-quality glass production in Europe for centuries. Their methods were so advanced, their glass so superior, that even kings and popes sought out Muranese products. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about precision. And precision was key to optical lenses. The sheer volume and consistency of high-quality glass coming from Murano meant that when the need for vision correction became pressing, the raw materials were ready and waiting. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some historical accounts suggest that the Muranese glassmakers were so fanatical about keeping their secrets that they would even sabotage their own furnaces if they suspected a rival, or worse, a foreign spy, was getting too close to understanding their techniques. Imagine a whole industry preferring to destroy its means of production rather than let a competitor gain an inch. That's dedication, or perhaps just extreme paranoia, depending on your perspective. It certainly puts modern corporate espionage into a rather quaint light, doesn't it? No wonder they were so good at keeping things quiet. Yet, despite this ironclad secrecy, innovation thrived. The closed system, ironically, fostered intense competition within the guild, pushing artisans to constantly refine their techniques and experiment with new forms and compositions. This internal drive for perfection, combined with an understanding of optics that was slowly, painstakingly being pieced together across Europe, meant that the ideal conditions were in place for the consistent production of lenses. Historians still argue whether the initial impetus for spectacle lenses came primarily from the glassmaker's existing skills and experimental spirit, or if it was driven more directly by external demand, perhaps from those very same scholarly circles who desperately needed to keep their eyes on the page. You can almost feel the collective sighs of relief from countless aging scribes, merchants, and scholars across Europe as the first truly effective lenses began to emerge from Murano. These weren't just pretty baubles. They were tools that could reclaim lost sight, extend working lives, and unlock new possibilities for knowledge. The sheer perfection required for optical glass, free of bubbles, striations, and discoloration, was a testament to Murano's magic. It wasn't about a single genius inventing everything overnight. It was about generations of dedicated artisans, bound by guild law and economic necessity, slowly perfecting a material that would, quite literally, change the way the world was seen. And it all happened here, on this little island, where fire and sand became the future. First specks, rivets, and balance. You've heard whispers from the Venetian glass furnaces, seen the shadowy figures of scribes hunched over illuminated manuscripts, and felt the strain in their eyes as they tried to discern intricate script in dim, flickering candlelight. Now it's time to finally put something on their faces, or rather, on your face, if you can imagine yourself stepping into a 13th century monastery, your vision a tad fuzzy. You are standing, or perhaps sitting on a rough-hewn bench, in a chilly scriptorium, the air thick with the scent of vellum, beeswax, and just a hint of damp stone. Before you, a monk, his brow furrowed, holds something truly revolutionary, yet utterly bizarre by your modern standards. Visualize the earliest, somewhat unwieldy, wearable eyeglasses. Forget the sleek, feather-light frames that perch almost invisibly on your nose today. These aren't that, not even close. What you're seeing are two thick, convex lenses, perfectly ground and polished by the skilled hands of Murano artisans. But the way they're presented, well, it's a bit of a contraption. Each lens is set into a sturdy frame, often made of bone, metal, or even rigid leather. These two individual lens frames aren't connected by a delicate bridge that rests on your nose. Oh no, that's a later innovation, a luxury for a future century. Instead, they're joined at the top by a sturdy, unyielding rivet. Think of a pair of oversized, non-folding binoculars, but with the lenses facing out, designed to sit directly on your face. Imagine trying to wear these. You pick them up, the cold metal or smooth bone feeling surprisingly substantial in your hand. You raise them to your eyes. The good news. The world immediately snaps into a glorious, magnified focus. The bad news, how exactly do they stay there? There are no temples, no arms extending back to hook over your ears. The concept simply hasn't been invented yet. So what's your option? You have to hold them, constantly. Imagine trying to read an entire book, or copy a sprawling manuscript, with one hand perpetually occupied holding these nascent vision aids to your face. Your arm would cramp, your neck would ache, and frankly, you probably won't survive this level of medieval discomfort without a serious complaining habit developing. This is why the earliest images of people using spectacles almost always depict them holding the contraption directly up to their eyes. It's less wearable and more handheld visual enhancement device. This initial design, often referred to as rivet spectacles, was a marvel of its time, despite its practical shortcomings. It solved a monumental problem: presbyopia, the age-related hardening of the eye's lens that makes close-up reading impossible. Before these riveted wonders, a scholar or merchant who lost their near vision in their 40s or 50s was simply out of luck. Their intellectual life, their ability to conduct detailed business, their very independence, could be severely curtailed. So, while you might scoff at the inconvenience, these humble riveted lenses were nothing short of a liberation for countless individuals. This is a mainstream historical fact. The earliest spectacles were indeed held or balanced, lacking ear hooks. Now, for a quirky tidbit. One theory, not entirely proven but certainly entertaining, suggests that some early users, desperate for a hands-free solution, might have attempted to balance these riveted spectacles precariously on their noses. Imagine the constant readjusting, the fear of them clattering to the floor. It's like trying to balance a house brick on your face and then attempting to thread a needle. Another hypothesis posits that people might have tucked the handles into their hats or headbands, creating a kind of proto-goggles. Given the sheer ingenuity born of necessity, it's entirely plausible. After all, if you can figure out how to make a magnifying glass out of a water-filled glass sphere, remember those? You can probably jury-rig a way to keep your new reading aid from sliding down your nose. Historians still argue whether the initial design featured a fixed rivet allowing no movement, or if some early versions had a pivot, allowing the lenses to swing open and closed like a pair of compasses, making them slightly more portable when not in use. The surviving examples are so few and the records often vague that it's hard to say definitively. Was it a rigid face clamp or a slightly more adaptable face folder? The nuances of 13th century metalwork and personal comfort are subjects of endless, fascinating debate. Despite these ergonomic challenges, the demand for these rivet spectacles exploded, particularly among the varied demographics we've discussed. Scholars, monks, merchants, and anyone whose livelihood depended on clear close-up vision. Imagine the sheer joy, the almost miraculous feeling of being able to read again after years of struggling with blurry text. It would have felt like gaining a new sense, or perhaps regaining one that had been lost to the relentless march of time. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief emanating from scriptoriums and counting houses across Europe. No longer were the elderly doomed to intellectual retirement. The world of letters, once a fading blur, was now sharp and inviting once more, all thanks to two pieces of curved glass and a strategically placed rivet. You feel the slightly awkward weight of those early, riveted contraptions perched on your nose, maybe even cinched by a leather strap around your head, a testament to innovation over comfort. You're holding a tangible miracle, something that shifts a blurry world into sharp focus. But the question isn't just how they were made, or who conceived them, but how this revolutionary aid, born in the secretive glass furnaces of Murano, escaped the Venetian lagoon to become a common sight across a continent. It wasn't a matter of simply mailing them, you understand. There was no medieval Amazon Prime, no swift postal service to deliver your latest optical enhancement. Instead, you can almost taste the dust of the roads and the salt spray of the seas, because the spread of spectacles across Europe was less about intentional distribution and more about the organic flow of medieval life itself. Think of the bustling trade routes, those ancient arteries pulsing with goods and ideas. Imagine the Venetian merchant, not just laden with silks from the east or spices from afar, but also quietly with a small, carefully packed wooden box containing these strange, new reading stones. He's not just selling luxury goods. He's an unwitting ambassador of a visual revolution, tucked away amongst his more traditional wares. You see him haggling in the marketplaces of Florence or unloading cargo in the bustling ports of Bruges. Perhaps he shows off his own pair, demonstrating their magic to a curious local dignitary or a wealthy banker whose eyesight has begun to fail. This wasn't a product advertised with grand pronouncements. It spread through whispers and demonstrations, through the simple, undeniable power of personal experience. One person sees, another desires, and soon, word travels faster than any courier could carry a physical package. This direct observation and the profound personal benefit became their most effective marketing campaign. But it wasn't just merchants. Scholars, those tireless seekers of knowledge, also played a crucial role. Imagine a Dominican friar, traveling from his monastery in Italy to a university in Paris or Oxford, carrying precious manuscripts and perhaps a personal pair of these new occhiali. He arrives, his eyes no longer strained by endless hours copying texts in dim light, and his colleagues notice the difference. They see his newfound efficiency, his ability to pore over scripture and philosophical treatises late into the night. It's a compelling argument, isn't it? The very people whose lives depended on their sight, those dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge, became the prime vectors for this optical innovation. You might even see a pilgrim trudging along the Camino de Santiago, perhaps a weary cleric with aging eyes, proudly wearing his spectacles, attracting a mix of awe and bewilderment from fellow travelers. And speaking of journeys, you probably wouldn't survive a single day on those medieval roads, let alone a multi-month pilgrimage, without succumbing to dysentery or bandits. But hey, at least you'd see clearly before you perished. The point is, every single movement of people, every exchange of goods, every intellectual discourse across geographical boundaries contributed to the slow, steady diffusion of this groundbreaking technology. Mainstream historical fact. The principal vectors for the diffusion of early spectacles were indeed the established mercantile networks and the extensive ecclesiastical and scholarly circuits of medieval Europe. The demand for enhanced vision among the literate elite, particularly clerics and jurists, created a ready market that transcended regional boundaries. These networks, though slow by modern standards, were incredibly effective at transmitting innovations, especially those that offered such a clear and immediate benefit. A quirky tidbit often overlooked in the grand narrative of spectacle dissemination is the secondary market that quickly emerged for broken or ill-fitting lenses. Imagine a sort of medieval optical recycling program. Because spectacles were precious and often custom-made to a degree, people would try to salvage them. You'd find itinerant tinkers and glass repairers, often not associated with the sophisticated Venetian guilds, who would attempt to mend frames or even grind down existing lenses to better fit a new wearer. It wasn't always successful, of course, and you'd end up with some truly bizarre, Frankenstein-esque visual aids, but it speaks to the desperate need and the value placed upon them. Historians still argue whether the initial spread was primarily driven by monastic demand for improved copying efficiency, or by the burgeoning merchant class eager to manage their complex account books with greater ease. Was it piety or profit that truly propelled spectacles across the Alps and beyond the Pyrenees? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Both groups certainly benefited immensely, creating a dual-pronged demand that ensured the innovation wouldn't remain confined to its Venetian birthplace. As these first, clunky versions made their way through Europe, they often passed through major urban centers that served as hubs of trade and intellectual exchange. Take Paris, for instance, with its renowned university, a magnet for scholars from all corners of the continent. Once spectacles arrived there, their utility would have been immediately recognized and coveted. From these urban centers, the knowledge, and eventually the actual physical spectacles, would then radiate outwards, reaching smaller towns and more remote monasteries. You can almost visualize the ripple effect, slowly expanding from the Italian peninsula. First, a few precious pairs arrive in major economic powerhouses like Florence and Genoa, then radiating to the Holy Roman Empire, France, England, and eventually, the farthest reaches of Christian Europe. It wasn't a sudden burst. It was a gradual, steady creep, driven by necessity and the sheer, undeniable utility of being able to read again, or to work with fine details late into your life. The world was literally and figuratively becoming clearer for more and more people. You stand in the scriptorium, the hushed heart of the monastery, the faint scent of parchment and beeswax clinging to the air. Dust motes dance in the slivers of light that pierce the narrow, leaded windows. Around you, hunched figures, robed and silent, meticulously copy texts. It's a scene centuries old, one that has defined the preservation and dissemination of knowledge since antiquity. But look closer. Something new is glinting on the faces of some of these dedicated souls. Something that wasn't there just a few decades ago. Something that changes everything. Remember those unwieldy, riveted spectacles we talked about, the ones that first clung precariously to noses, requiring a steady hand or a convenient desk to keep them in place. Well, they've traveled, as we saw, across the continent, finding their way into the hands that need them most. The hands of those whose lives are dedicated to the written word. Before these miraculous little contraptions arrived, imagine the plight of the aging scholar. You spend your youth devouring texts, your mind sharp, your eyes keen. You're a fount of knowledge, a living library, a master of languages, a commentator on ancient wisdom. You are indispensable. Then, slowly, insidiously, a blur descends. The crisp black lines of ink on vellum begin to waver. The delicate illuminations, once so vibrant, become a confusing wash of color. The tiny script, once legible with ease, now demands an excruciating squint, followed by a throbbing headache that lasts for hours. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a career ender, a life sentence to intellectual twilight. For centuries, learned individuals, often those who had dedicated their entire lives to study and contemplation, faced an inevitable wall. Your brain might still be brimming with insights, your memory a vast repository of facts. But if you couldn't read the very source material, if you couldn't verify a citation, if you couldn't write your own commentaries without crippling eye strain, your productive years were simply, brutally over. You'd become a consultant, perhaps, someone who could dictate. But the intimate, direct engagement with the text, the solitary joy of discovery in a dusty tome, that was gone. You probably won't survive this intellectual senescence in a medieval monastery. By the way, your value drops considerably, and the warm, cushy abbot's chair probably isn't awaiting you. But then, the Murano masters, with their closely guarded secrets of glass alchemy, brought forth the lens. And the lens found its way into those riveted spectacles, and those spectacles found their way to the monasteries, the universities, the private studies of merchant princes and burgeoning bureaucrats. Suddenly, the impossible was possible again. The aging scribe, whose once nimble fingers had grown stiff and whose eyes had grown weary, could now pick up his quill, don his spectacles, and continue his painstaking work of copying, of illuminating, of preserving the ancient wisdom that defined their world. It was nothing short of an intellectual resurrection. Consider the sheer output. Before spectacles, a monk might have a good 30 or 40 years of effective reading and copying before presbyopia set in, turning their carefully curated library into an inaccessible blur. After spectacles, that productive window could extend by another 10, 20, even 30 years. This wasn't just about individual longevity. It was about the cumulative knowledge of an era. More years for more scholars meant more books copied, more commentaries written, more ideas debated, more knowledge circulated. It was a quiet revolution, transforming the very fabric of medieval scholarship. The sheer volume of texts produced in the centuries after the widespread adoption of spectacles saw a dramatic increase, marking a pivotal shift in how knowledge was accumulated and disseminated. This, our mainstream historical fact for the day, isn't just a coincidence. It's a direct correlation. More tools, more output. It's like giving a baker a stand mixer instead of a wooden spoon. Suddenly, the bread output goes way up, and everyone is happier and probably a little heavier. Now, for a quirky tidbit. There's some evidence that initially spectacles weren't just seen as a tool, but also as a status symbol. Imagine that. An aging scholar, newly sighted, not only gaining back his livelihood, but also sporting the latest in optical technology. It was a sign of learning, of prosperity, of being at the cutting edge of medieval innovation. Some portraits from the era show scholars prominently wearing spectacles, almost as a badge of honor, a testament to their intellectual prowess and their access to these marvels. It was the medieval equivalent of having the newest iPhone, only instead of looking at cat videos, you were looking at meticulously hand-copied religious texts, which, let's be honest, is probably less entertaining, but significantly more pious. Still, the true extent of the immediate impact is a subject of ongoing discussion. Historians still argue whether the invention of spectacles directly spurred a renaissance in scientific and literary endeavors, or if they merely facilitated an intellectual ferment that was already brewing. Was it the spark, or merely the kindling? There's no single, universally accepted answer, as isolating the impact of one invention in a complex historical tapestry is like trying to untangle a single thread from a very old, very knotty medieval tapestry. You pull too hard, and the whole thing unravels. But what is undeniable is the profound personal transformation. You, the aging scholar, once resigned to the quiet solitude of your failing vision, now feel a surge of renewed purpose. The world of letters opens up again. You can see the faint pencil marks guiding the scribe's hand. You can correct errors in ancient manuscripts. You can lose yourself in the dense philosophical treatises late into the night, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the page, your spectacles reflecting the tiny flames like twin beacons of restored vision. It was a literal light to their eyes, and it allowed the accumulated wisdom of millennia to continue to grow, to be copied, to be expanded upon, laying the very groundwork for the intellectual explosions that would follow. The quiet rustle of parchment as you turn a page, the satisfying scratch of your quill on its surface. These were sounds that once threatened to fade into memory, but now, thanks to two small pieces of ground glass, they echo on, vibrant and clear, for decades more. You stride through the bustling piazza, the sun warm on your face, a gentle breeze rustling the rich fabric of your tunic. Around you, the vibrant tapestry of a 14th century Italian city unfolds. Cobblestone streets hum with the murmur of merchants hawking their wares, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, and the distant peal of church bells. You, however, are not just any observer in this tableau. You are a person of means, a scholar, perhaps a well-to-do merchant, and clutched in your hand, or perhaps even perched delicately upon your nose, is a pair of spectacles. Now, pause and consider this scene for a moment. You're not wearing them because you're squinting at a tiny inscription on a faraway monument, or trying to read the fine print on a new trade agreement from across the room. Oh no. The vision aid you hold, or wear, is less about purely functional assistance and far more about making a statement. This isn't your grandma's reading glasses. tucked away in a felt case, pulled out only for the crossword puzzle. These are the spectacles. They whisper, no, they positively shout of wealth, of intellectual pursuits, of a certain elevated standing in a world where clear vision for close work was a luxury few could maintain into their later years. Remember those monastic scribes, their eyes strained from years hunched over manuscripts, ink smudged on their fingers. For them, spectacles were a godsend, a lifeline to continue their sacred work. For you, the elite, they are almost a piece of jewelry, a signpost of your position. Imagine, for a moment, life without them. You're already familiar with the struggle, aren't you? The frustrating blur, the premature end to a productive working life, the constant headache from eye strain. Now magnify that, remove all modern conveniences, and consider the average person. If you were a peasant relying on your hands for labor, or a craftsman needing keen vision for intricate work, and your eyesight began to fail in your 40s or 50s, well, you probably won't survive this economic downturn. Your ability to provide for yourself, your family, it diminishes rapidly. There's no prescription lens store on every corner, no quick fix. You simply slow down. You become less productive, more reliant on others. So when you see a person of means sporting these miraculous devices, it's not just relief you're witnessing. It's a testament to their privilege, their foresight, pun absolutely intended, and their investment in preserving their most valuable asset. Their ability to engage with the written word, to manage their affairs, to see their world clearly. Early spectacles were, by necessity, a luxury item. The glass itself, remember that Venetian magic we talked about. It was still a closely guarded secret, meticulously crafted and expensive. The frames, too, weren't mass-produced plastic. Oh no, we're talking about materials like bone, horn, finely wrought metal, bronze, silver, occasionally even gold. Each pair was often custom-made, or at least custom-fitted, a unique piece designed for an individual. It wasn't like popping into the local optometrist and picking out frames from a wall display. You had to seek out the craftsman, often a master glassworker or a skilled artisan, and commission these pieces. The very act of acquiring them was a transaction that spoke volumes about your financial standing. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a bespoke carriage, or owning a library full of illuminated manuscripts, rather than just a few scrolls copied by hand. Think of the portraits from this era, like the famous one of Hugh of Saintshire, often cited as one of the earliest depictions of spectacles. He's not wearing them in a purely functional pose, hunched over a book. No, he's depicted with them prominently, almost as an emblem. These weren't hidden away, they were displayed. They were a badge of honor, a symbol of wisdom and learning. It's a bit like someone today flashing a brand new, top-of-the-line smartphone, not just for its features, but for the inherent statement it makes about their connection to technology, their resources. Only with spectacles, the statement was far more profound. I am educated, I can read, I engage with the world of ideas. This was a mainstream historical fact, the depiction of spectacles in art, showcasing their symbolic significance. And what about the quirky tidbits? Well, some early designs were less than subtle. We've discussed the rivet spectacles, two lenses joined by a hinge, held to the face or simply held in the hand. But imagine a pair designed specifically to be worn on a hat. Yes, you heard that right. Some were fashioned to be attached to headwear, almost like a permanent, very clunky visor, just for those moments you needed to peer at something up close. You can picture it, can't you? A distinguished gentleman tipping his hat not just in greeting, but to adjust his reading aid. It conjures a rather amusing image, doesn't it? A kind of medieval fashion statement that screams, "I am so important, I don't even need hands to hold my spectacles." As the popularity of spectacles grew amongst the elite, a fascinating sociological shift began. They weren't just for reading or writing. They became accessories for intellectual gatherings, items discussed in polite society. You might even see someone wearing them simply for appearance, even if their vision was perfectly fine. A bit like someone wearing non-prescription glasses today to look smarter or more artistic. It's a testament to the power of perception, even back then. Historians still argue whether this initial adoption by the wealthy truly accelerated literacy rates across broader social strata, or if it merely deepened the intellectual chasm between the haves and have-nots for a significant period. While spectacles undeniably prolonged the productive lives of scholars and merchants, enabling them to read and write well into old age, their high cost ensured they remained largely inaccessible to the general populace for quite some time. The spread of knowledge was still primarily an oral tradition for many, or reliant on those few who could afford and access the written word. So, while you, the privileged wearer, basked in the clarity these lenses afforded, much of the world remained in a literal and metaphorical blur. This was just the beginning of their journey from exclusive status symbol to indispensable tool. Gutenberg's press, reading's Big Bang. The printing press fueled an explosive demand for clear vision. You feel a tremor beneath your feet, not an earthquake, but something far more seismic for the human mind. The air, once thick with the laborious scratch of quill on parchment, and the faint scent of lamp oil from some monastic scriptorium, is now punctuated by the rhythmic thud and groan of massive wooden machinery. Imagine a world where information was hoarded, painstakingly reproduced by hand, a precious commodity shared only among the elite, or painstakingly copied by the dedicated, often bespectacled, or soon-to-be bespectacled scribes we talked about earlier, their eyes already aching, remember. Now picture a revolution, a quiet, ink-stained revolution that's about to explode into being, shattering centuries of scarcity. This is it, the moment. You're standing in the shadow of Johannes Gutenberg's press in Mainz, somewhere around the mid-15th century, and the future is quite literally pressing down upon you. Before this behemoth, a single book could take months, even years, to produce. Monks, hunched over their desks, would meticulously copy every letter, every illumination. It was a slow, arduous process, a marathon of concentration that stretched the limits of human vision. But now, with a clunk and a scrape, movable type is being inked, paper is pressed, and in the time it took one scribe to finish a single page, Gutenberg's press could churn out hundreds. This, my friend, is the Big Bang of information, and its ripples are about to create an unprecedented demand for something that, until very recently, was still a luxury, a peculiar Italian invention, the humble spectacle. Suddenly, reading isn't just for monks or the super-rich who could afford bespoke, hand-copied texts. Books, pamphlets, broadsides, they're becoming accessible, cheaper, and more plentiful than ever before. You can practically hear the collective sigh of relief, followed quickly by a collective squint. Because while the word count on a page skyrockets, the print quality, especially in those nascent years, could be, let's just say, variable. Imagine trying to decipher a slightly smudged, inconsistently inked paragraph, day in and day out, for pleasure or profit. You're not just reading. You're deciphering an archaeological find, one tiny, ink-stained relic at a time. This isn't your crisp, high-resolution e-reader, no, sir. This is the wild west of typography, where every page is an adventure and often an optical endurance test. This newfound accessibility of texts meant more people, from merchants to scholars, apprentices to housewives, were trying to read. And many, perhaps for the first time, were realizing just how blurry their world truly was. Think about it. If reading was rare, if books were precious and few, the struggle of a 40-year-old's diminishing near vision might not have been a daily torment. You just accepted it as part of getting older, perhaps resigned to a life of relying on others to read aloud, or simply gave up on intricate tasks. But now, with the promise of knowledge, entertainment, and even civic engagement literally at your fingertips, or rather, right in front of your struggling eyeballs, the need for a visual aid became urgent, undeniable. You might finally acknowledge that, yes, those tiny little squiggles on the page are actually just squiggles and not words until you find something to help. The mainstream historical fact here is pretty clear. The advent of the printing press exponentially increased the volume of printed materials available to the public. Before Gutenberg, Europe was estimated to have around 30,000 books in total. By 1500, just 50 years after the press's widespread adoption, that number had exploded to somewhere between 10 to 20 million books. That's not a typo, that's millions with an ma. Can you even fathom that scale of information proliferation? It's like going from a trickle to a tsunami overnight. And every single one of those books, every new pamphlet, every newly printed Bible, was another potential customer for a spectacle maker. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Early printed books often had incredibly small typefaces. Why? Because paper was still expensive. To maximize the number of words per page and minimize paper usage, printers would cram as much text as possible onto each sheet. Imagine reading an entire Bible printed in what we'd now consider a 6-point font. It's enough to make your eyes water just thinking about it. No wonder so many people were suddenly finding themselves in desperate need of those Murano-made lenses. It wasn't just the sheer volume of reading material. It was the microscopic nature of much of it that truly put a strain on the eyes. You'd need the vision of a hawk and the patience of a saint, or, a pair of glasses. This brings us to a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. To what extent did the printing press directly cause an increase in literacy? And how much did it merely serve a pre-existing, growing desire for reading that was already being nurtured by other factors, like the rise of universities and merchant classes? Historians still argue whether the press was the primary driver of the literacy boom, or if it simply met an escalating demand that was already there. Either way, the relationship between the two is undeniable. More books meant more potential readers, and more readers, particularly those past the prime of their unassisted vision, meant a burgeoning market for spectacles. It's a chicken and egg scenario, but the egg, in this case, definitely involves tiny print and aching eyes. The demand wasn't just from the elderly, either. Scholars, who now had access to multiple copies of texts for comparative study, found themselves spending more hours poring over manuscripts. Even young apprentices, required to read guild regulations or instructional manuals, discovered their own limitations when faced with dense, typeset pages. The printing press democratized knowledge, yes, but it also democratized eye strain. It was like suddenly everyone had a high-resolution screen in front of them, but they hadn't invented the zoom function yet. Your only option was to literally put a piece of magnifying glass in front of your face. You probably wouldn't survive this new world without them, let's be honest. Imagine navigating modern life without being able to read street signs, menus, or your phone. That's pretty much the reality many faced until glasses became commonplace. The societal shift was profound. No longer was knowledge solely transmitted through oral tradition or the painstaking work of a few scribes. It was now laid out, page after page, for anyone with the means to acquire a book and the vision to read it. And if the vision wasn't quite up to snuff, well, there was an Italian invention, now spreading across Europe, that could help. The press didn't just print books. It printed a future where clear sight was no longer a privilege of the young, but a requirement for anyone wishing to engage with the rapidly expanding world of the printed word. The stage was set, the demand was roaring, and the humble spectacle was about to take its place center stage in the drama of human progress. Mass production, specs for commoners. Spectacles became increasingly affordable and widespread. You're standing perhaps in a bustling marketplace, not unlike the one you might imagine in your own town, but louder, smellier, and certainly far less concerned with health and safety regulations. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meats, damp earth, and an undercurrent of unwashed humanity that, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive more than a week in without modern hygiene. But amidst the cacophony, something subtle is shifting. You're not just seeing the wealthy merchants or the cloistered scholars sporting those curious lens-laden contraptions anymore. No, look closer. Over by the fishmonger's stall, a grizzled old woman, her hands calloused from decades of labor, squints not at the price board, but through a pair of simple, sturdy spectacles perched precariously on her nose. Near the cooper, hammering away at a barrel, a younger man, perhaps an apprentice, uses his own pair to examine the intricate grain of the wood, catching details he'd missed for years. This isn't a fluke, a one-off sighting. This is a burgeoning revolution, unfolding almost imperceptibly, one pair of spectacles at a time. The shift from an exclusive luxury to a common commodity didn't happen overnight, of course. It was a slow, grinding evolution, driven by a confluence of factors that began to democratize clear vision. Remember how we talked about Murano and their fiercely guarded secrets, their almost alchemical mastery of glass? Well, even the tightest monopolies eventually face pressure, either from internal innovation or, more often, from external competition. As the demand for spectacles skyrocketed, particularly after Gutenberg's press began churning out books like freshly baked loaves, the economic incentive to crack Murano's code, or at least to find viable alternatives, became immense. Glassmakers across Europe, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands, began to experiment. They didn't necessarily steal Venetian formulas outright, though industrial espionage was certainly not unknown even then. Instead, they refined their own techniques, often by trial and error, by pushing the boundaries of what local sands and furnaces could achieve. This wasn't about recreating Murano's dazzling colored glass for stained glass windows or ornate goblets. It was about perfecting a specific type of clear, uniform glass, ideal for grinding into optical lenses. The process of grinding and polishing lenses was still painstaking, an artisanal craft requiring immense skill. But as demand grew, so did specialization. Workshops started to emerge where glass blowers produced rough blanks, and then other skilled craftsmen took over, shaping and polishing them into the precise curves needed for vision correction. This division of labor, a precursor to modern manufacturing lines, meant that more lenses could be produced more quickly, and critically more consistently. And it wasn't just the lenses that saw innovation. The frames, initially unwieldy riveted affairs or heavy bone constructions, began to evolve. As the market expanded, makers started experimenting with lighter materials like leather, horn, and even increasingly affordable metals. Designs became simpler, more functional, less about ostentatious display, and more about practical utility. Imagine a medieval craftsman trying to fit hundreds of different faces with a limited range of frame sizes. It was less about bespoke tailoring and more about finding a good enough fit. Think of it like trying to buy ready-to-wear clothing when everything used to be custom-made. It's not perfect, but it gets the job done and it's a fraction of the price. This newfound affordability had profound societal implications. For centuries, literacy, though increasing, was still largely a young person's game. Or, at least, a game for those with naturally good eyesight that endured well into old age. But with spectacles, older individuals, whose vision had inevitably dimmed with age, found a second wind. A merchant could continue to pore over ledgers well into his 60s. A weaver could meticulously follow patterns. A scholar could continue to delve into ancient texts without relying solely on youthful apprentices. It wasn't just about reading. It was about maintaining economic viability and intellectual engagement for longer stretches of life. This really was a mainstream historical fact. The extension of productive working lives for artisans and professionals due to widespread spectacle availability. One quirky tidbit about this era of increasing affordability is the rise of the itinerant spectacle vendor. Forget the high-end optician's shop with its velvet seats and precise measurements. Instead, picture a peddler, a sort of medieval door-to-door salesman with a tray of spectacles, perhaps of varying powers, hanging around markets or even traveling from village to village. He wouldn't have sophisticated testing equipment, of course. His method, he'd simply have you try on different pairs until one felt right. It was a trial-and-error approach, often relying on the user's subjective feeling of clarity. "Does this make the letters less blurry, good sir?" he'd ask, holding up a cheap printed broadside. "Better, excellent, that will be 3 pence. It was less about prescription and more about approximation, but for many it was enough. Historians still argue whether the increased affordability of spectacles directly spurred a greater general literacy rate among the common populace, or if it merely facilitated deeper engagement for those already literate. It's a bit of a chicken-and-egg scenario. Did people learn to read because spectacles made it easier, or did the rising desire for reading, fueled by printed books, push down the cost of spectacles? What is clear, however, is the symbiotic relationship between the two. One fed the other, creating a virtuous cycle where accessible vision and accessible knowledge propelled each other forward. The widespread availability of spectacles also began to chip away at the mystique that had surrounded them. No longer were they solely an emblem of the intellectual elite, a subtle flex of status. They became tools, pure and simple. This normalization meant that the psychological barrier to wearing them diminished significantly. If your neighbor, the baker, wore them to read his prayer book, why shouldn't you wear them to read your trade guild's rules? The visual landscape of Europe was subtly but fundamentally altered. More people of more diverse backgrounds were now able to interact with the written word, with detailed maps, with intricate drawings, with the very fabric of an increasingly complex society. Consider the ripple effect. If more people could read, more people would want to read. If more people wanted to read, the demand for printed materials would further increase, putting pressure on printers to produce even more and more cheaply. This, in turn, fueled the demand for paper, for ink, for skilled typesetters. It was an economic engine, small at first, but gaining incredible momentum with each passing decade. The simple act of putting lenses in front of someone's eyes had inadvertently jump-started an entire industry, transforming not just individual lives, but the very infrastructure of knowledge dissemination. You might think of it as the original killer app, not for a smartphone, but for the human eye. And unlike your smartphone, which probably requires a constant stream of new updates and a monthly subscription, these original specs were a one-time purchase, a true investment in clarity, a permanent upgrade to your personal operating system without the need for Wi-Fi. It's almost quaint, isn't it? It's easy to look back and see the inevitability of this progression, from luxury item to mass-produced tool. But at the time, each step was a challenge, a negotiation with material limitations, with established guilds, with the very human tendency to resist change. The artisans who perfected the glass, the entrepreneurs who risked capital on new workshops, the peddlers who walked miles to sell a handful of frames. They were all unwitting participants in a revolution that, ironically, made it easier for people to see the world more clearly, and in doing so, changed it irrevocably. Optical science blooms, Kepler's insights. Scientific minds began to understand light and lenses deeper. You've got your mass-produced spectacles, right? They're clunking on noses across Europe, making blurry manuscripts crisp and enabling commoners to read their newly printed pamphlets. It's a vision revolution, all right, but here's the kicker. For a long, long time, nobody really understood why these pieces of glass actually worked. It was magic, empirical trial and error, a happy accident that just did the trick. Imagine building a self-driving car without understanding combustion, or even the wheel. That was the state of optics for centuries. People knew lenses bent light, sure, but the intricate dance of light rays, the internal mechanics of your very own eyeball, and how the two interacted to produce clear vision. That was still mostly in the Dark Ages, metaphorically speaking, despite the sudden proliferation of literal light-bending devices. You're living in a world where light is still a bit of a mystery, perceived more as a mystical emanation or a stream of particles rather than something that could be systematically dissected. And honestly, if you were living then, attempting to understand these concepts without our modern tools and foundational physics, well, you probably wouldn't survive this long trying to figure it out. It's a testament to human curiosity that anyone even bothered. Then, around the dawn of the 17th century, a brilliant mind steps onto the stage, a German astronomer named Johannes Kepler. Now, Kepler, you might remember from your high school science class, was famous for figuring out that planets don't orbit in perfect circles, but in ellipses. He was a meticulous observer, a mathematical wizard, and utterly obsessed with the heavens. But he didn't just look up, he also looked in. Specifically, he looked into the human eye. Before Kepler, the prevailing theory was often the emission theory, the idea that your eyes actually emitted rays like tiny searchlights that then bounced off objects and returned, giving you sight. It sounds a bit like something out of a particularly strange superhero comic, doesn't it? But it was a widely accepted, albeit unproven, notion. People just went with it. Why wouldn't you? Your eyes feel like they're doing the seeing, not just passively receiving. Kepler, however, was having none of it. He brought a rigorous mathematical and experimental approach to optics that was truly groundbreaking. You can almost picture him, hunched over diagrams, squinting through lenses, trying to map the invisible paths of light. He was the first to accurately describe how an image is formed on the retina at the back of the eye. He realized that the eye essentially functions like a camera obscura. a darkened box with a small hole, projecting an inverted image onto the opposite surface. Your eye, he proposed, does the same thing, with the pupil acting as the aperture and the lens within your eye focusing the light onto the retina. Mainstream historical fact alert. Kepler published his findings in 1604 in a work titled Ad Vitalianum Paralipomena, which translates to Supplements to Whitelow, in which the optical part of astronomy is treated. This was the definitive text that finally and correctly explained the optics of the eye. It sounds rather dry, but it was anything but. It was a revolution in understanding. He didn't stop there, though. Once he understood how the eye worked, he could then logically deduce why spectacles worked. He realized that nearsightedness, myopia, was caused by the eye focusing light in front of the retina, and farsightedness, hyperopia, by light focusing behind it. And the solution: concave lenses for myopia, diverging the light rays slightly before they enter the eye, pushing the focal point back onto the retina. Convex lenses for hyperopia, converging the light rays, pulling the focal point forward. It's so elegant, so logical once you have the underlying principles. Before Kepler, it was like saying, "This special rock makes things clearer," without knowing about refraction or focal points. Now it was, "This special rock changes the path of light because of its curvature," precisely counteracting the flaw in your eye's natural lens. It's a bit like explaining why your toaster makes toast, rather than just admiring the warm, crispy outcome. Now for a quirky tidbit. Kepler also experimented with what we now call total internal reflection. While not directly related to spectacles, it shows his broad interest in light. He figured out that if light hits the boundary between two transparent materials at a sufficiently shallow angle, it won't pass through. It'll just bounce back like a billiard ball off a cushion. You see this phenomenon every time you look into a swimming pool from underwater. The surface looks like a mirror. He wasn't just fixing vision. He was unraveling the very fabric of light itself. Of course, the immediate adoption of Kepler's precise mathematical models wasn't instantaneous. Ideas, even brilliant ones, take time to permeate. Historians still argue whether Kepler's detailed optical theories were fully appreciated by spectacle makers and opticians in his immediate aftermath, or if it took another century or two for the theoretical understanding to truly catch up with the practical craft. Was it an overnight sensation or a slow burn? Did the average spectacle vendor suddenly become a physicist, or did they continue to rely on their guild secrets and empirical fitting? The jury, as they say, is still out. But one thing is certain. Kepler pulled optics out of the realm of pure empiricism and into the light of scientific rigor. He gave the world the foundational understanding that explained why those simple pieces of glass could so dramatically alter a person's ability to interact with the written word, solidifying the role of the spectacle as not just a convenient tool, but a marvel of applied scientific principle. His work paved the way for future advancements, for telescopes that revealed distant stars, and microscopes that showed the unseen world, all built on the bedrock of understanding how light truly behaves. Fashion follies, pince-nez and lorgnettes. You find yourself in a bustling Victorian salon, the air thick with the scent of lilies and hushed gossip. Sunlight streams through tall, arched windows, catching dust motes dancing in the golden beams. You watch as a woman, exquisitely dressed in layers of silk and lace, raises a delicate instrument to her eyes. It's not just a tool. It's an extension of her very posture, an elegant flourish in a world obsessed with appearances. This, you realize, is the dawn of spectacles as true fashion accessories. a far cry from the utilitarian, often clunky designs we pondered earlier. No longer solely the realm of the stooped scholar or the aging artisan, vision aids were stepping onto the runway, quite literally, of high society. Imagine the discomfort first of the pince-nez. Pince-nez, meaning nose pinchers in French, were exactly that. You slip one on, and immediately you feel the gentle, then not so gentle, pressure on the bridge of your nose. There's no earpiece, no frame resting comfortably behind your ears. Just two lenses, sometimes round, sometimes oval, connected by a spring-loaded bridge that clamps onto your schnoz. It's a miracle they stayed on at all, especially during an enthusiastic sneeze. Frankly, you probably won't survive a sudden head shake without losing these things to the floor. Yet for decades, they were the height of chic, particularly popular from the 1880s through the early 20th century. Men often sported them, sometimes attached to a chain or ribbon pinned to their lapel, a sort of optical leash, ensuring your precious vision aid didn't go rogue. For women, it was less about practicality and more about the dramatic gesture of raising them to the face, a subtle theatricality in a social engagement. Then there were the lorgnettes. If the pince-nez was the minimalist, no fuss, but lots of pinch option, the lorgnette was its flamboyant cousin. You picture it, two lenses, foldable, attached to a handle. Think opera glasses, but for reading a menu across a dimly lit restaurant or discreetly scrutinizing a new arrival at a ball. You hold it with a practiced flick of the wrist, a gesture that conveyed sophistication and a certain aloof elegance. It wasn't about wearing them constantly. It was about the moment of use. You'd pull it from your reticule, open it with a snap, and perhaps with a subtle smirk peer at something or someone of interest. Lorgnettes were particularly popular among women in the 18th and 19th centuries, becoming an indispensable part of their evening wear. The handles themselves became works of art, crafted from mother-of-pearl, tortoise shell, ivory, gold, or silver, often encrusted with jewels. They were less about correcting vision for prolonged periods and more about making a statement. Yes, I need glasses, but look how exquisitely I need them. This shift from pure utility to aesthetic statement reveals a fascinating evolution in human priorities. When glasses were rare, their purpose was paramount. But as mass production brought them within reach of more people, remember Gutenberg's press and the subsequent demand, leading to more affordable specs for commoners. The elite needed new ways to distinguish themselves. Commoners might have a serviceable pair of spectacles, but only the truly fashionable could afford the delicate mechanism of a gold pince-nez or a jeweled lorgnette. It became an accessory akin to a fan or a pocket watch, an indicator of status and taste. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for these designs was genuinely improved vision for the masses, or if it was the burgeoning middle class's desire to emulate the upper echelons of society. Was it function following form, or form following a rather desperate need to look important? It's easy to chuckle now at the thought of a spring-loaded clamp on your nose, or a handle that required constant holding. We've come a long way from those charmingly impractical designs to the lightweight, ergonomic frames that sit so comfortably on your face today. But at the time, these were revolutionary, not in their optical science, which was already benefiting from Kepler's insights and advancing understanding of light and lenses, but in their social engineering. They transformed the very act of seeing into a public performance. You didn't just see, you performed seeing. You executed a subtle ballet with your hands, your head, your eyes, all centered around this small, significant object. Consider the sheer variety of materials and designs that emerged. Some pince-nez even had an early form of nose pads, often made of cork or rubber, which, while probably more comfortable than bare metal, probably also absorbed a lot of facial oils. Don't think too hard about that. And the lorgnettes, oh, the lorgnettes. Some were built into a snuff box or even a fan, allowing for the ultimate in discreet viewing. Imagine you're at the theater, fanning yourself languidly, and then, with a barely perceptible click, your fan transforms into a viewing aid to catch a distant actor's expression. It's like a secret agent's gadget, but for reading very large print across a very wide room. This blend of form and function, sometimes bordering on the utterly absurd from a modern perspective, speaks volumes about the societal pressures and aspirations of the era. People wanted to see clearly, yes, but they also wanted to look good doing it, even if it meant a slight sacrifice in sustained comfort. It was a trade-off, like wearing ridiculously uncomfortable shoes just because they're in style. Some things, it seems, never change. You step through the heavy wooden door, and the hum hits you first. A symphony of hushed whispers, the rustle of turning pages, the soft clatter of porcelain on saucers. The air, thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and aging paper, wraps around you like a warm blanket. This isn't a monk's cell, nor a king's private study. No, this, my friend, is the beating heart of a new intellectual age. A vibrant, public arena where ideas, once confined to dusty vellum and scholarly hands, now dance openly. You see people everywhere, their heads bent over books, newspapers, pamphlets, many of them sporting those recently mass-produced spectacles, perched on noses, or dangling from elegant chains. It's a sight, isn't it? Almost as revolutionary as the concept of not dying from a paper cut. Speaking of dying, imagine living in this era without your trusty specs. You probably wouldn't survive the endless squinting required to decipher those tiny printed letters, let alone cross the street without bumping into a horse-drawn carriage. Your eyes would simply give out, leaving you functionally blind long before your time. Think about it. No Netflix binges, no endless scrolling, just blur. And given the generally less than sterile conditions of the time, getting a simple eye infection could spell disaster. So yeah, you probably wouldn't survive this world without those precious lenses, especially not if you wanted to join the burgeoning ranks of the publicly literate. It's enough to make you want to hug your optometrist, isn't it? Though optometrists as we know them are still a twinkle in the future's eye. For now, you're just happy to get a pair of glasses that don't pinch your nose quite so much. The rise of spectacles, as we've seen, dovetailed perfectly with Gutenberg's revolution. More books, more readers, and crucially, more public places for those readers to congregate. This wasn't just about individual literacy. It was about the democratization of knowledge. Public libraries, once exclusive domains of the wealthy or the religious, began to open their doors wider, sometimes through subscription models, sometimes through philanthropic ventures. You'd find yourself amidst merchants poring over shipping manifests, scholars debating ancient texts, and even curious artisans seeking practical knowledge. But perhaps even more iconic, certainly more aromatic, were the coffee houses. These weren't just places for a caffeine fix. They were the original social media platforms, the bustling hubs of intellectual exchange. Imagine stepping into a coffee house in 17th century London. The air is thick with smoke, chatter, and the rich, dark aroma of coffee, a relatively new and exotic beverage. You'd find newspapers tacked to the walls, available for everyone to read, often aloud, sparking spirited discussions. You might even stumble upon a group of gentlemen avidly discussing politics, or perhaps the latest scientific discovery, their spectacles glinting in the dim light filtering through the window. One quirky tidbit: some coffee houses even offered a penny university, where, for the price of a cup of coffee, you could listen to lectures, join debates, or simply read the latest pamphlets. It was truly a marketplace of ideas, often vibrant to the point of chaos, with arguments erupting over everything from theology to the proper way to brew a cuppa. You'd probably need those spectacles just to read the menu through the haze of pipe smoke. And good luck finding a quiet corner. Historians still argue whether these coffee houses were primarily places of radical dissent or simply extensions of existing social networks. Some contend they fostered revolutionary thought by providing a space for uncensored discussion outside traditional institutions, leading directly to movements like the Enlightenment. Others argue they largely reinforced existing class structures, albeit with a slightly more inclusive veneer. What is undeniable, however, is the profound shift in the very act of reading. It was no longer a solitary, silent pursuit confined to the cloister or the study. Reading became a public performance, a communal act, even if performed silently by an individual. You might sit alone with your book, but you were surrounded by a collective intelligence, a shared engagement with the written word. Think about the implications of this shift. If you, as an ordinary person, could now access books, pamphlets, and newspapers, your world would expand exponentially. Before, your knowledge was limited to what you heard, what you saw, and what you could remember. Now you held the accumulated wisdom of ages in your hands, made legible by your trusty spectacles. It meant merchants could learn about distant markets, artisans could improve their crafts with new techniques, and ordinary citizens could form their own opinions on political matters, rather than simply accepting what they were told. The very architecture of cities began to reflect this new thirst for knowledge. Libraries, once stately but often inaccessible, began to pop up with more regularity, sometimes funded by public subscription, sometimes by generous patrons who understood the power of an informed populace. These weren't always grand, echoing halls. Some were small, dusty rooms, crammed with shelves, but each book a window to another world, another idea. And you, with your glasses firmly on your nose, were suddenly empowered to open those windows yourself. Imagine the sheer volume of new material now being printed, devoured by this newly sighted public. From philosophical treatises to sensational broadsides, the presses worked overtime. And every new publication, every new idea shared, reinforced the need for clear vision. The cycle was self-perpetuating. More glasses, more readers, more demand for printed material. More printed material, more need for glasses. It was a beautiful, symbiotic relationship. The transition wasn't always smooth, of course. There were those who viewed this public proliferation of reading with suspicion, fearing it would lead to unrest or, even worse, people having their own thoughts. But the tide had turned. The genie of widespread literacy, uncorked by the printing press and enabled by spectacles, was not going back into its bottle. You were now part of a vast, silent, reading army, each soldier armed with a book and a pair of lenses, ready to conquer ignorance one page at a time. It was a quiet revolution, fought not with swords, but with words made visible. The coffee houses, in particular, became nurseries for intellectual movements. Discussions that started over a single cup of coffee could, and often did, morph into grand philosophical debates, scientific societies, and even political movements. Imagine eavesdropping on conversations that would later shape nations, all because someone could clearly read a pamphlet describing a new political theory. It sounds almost quaint now, in our age of instant digital information, but back then, this was cutting edge. This was radical. This was where the future was being brewed, quite literally, alongside your morning cup. The sheer volume of conversations, the clash of ideas, the constant exposure to new perspectives, it all contributed to a profound intellectual ferment. You could walk into one of these establishments a simple observer, and walk out with a completely new understanding of the world, simply by listening and reading. It was an education available to anyone with a few coins and a desire to learn, an education made truly accessible by the simple fact that you could now clearly see the words on the page. Remember how, not so long ago, a scholar's entire productive life might be cut short by failing eyesight. Well, now, even the common man, if he had the inclination and a pair of affordable spectacles, could extend his intellectual life well into old age. He could continue to learn, to read, to engage. The concept of lifelong learning, at least for a broader segment of the population, became a tangible reality. This was more than just a convenience, it was a societal shift. Information, once guarded by the elite, was now flowing more freely, often right into the hands and past the spectacles of the general public. It meant that the power of ideas could spread with unprecedented speed, sparking revolutions not just of the mind, but of society itself. The ink on the page, made clear by your lenses, carried immense weight. It was truly a brave new world, and you, reading this, are living proof of its enduring legacy. The clinking of teacups, the murmured debates, the gentle turning of pages, it all coalesced into the sound of progress. Literacy explosion, society reshaped. The widespread ability to read sparked profound societal changes. You walk through the bustling market square, not just seeing faces, but seeing eyes. Eyes that once scanned the ground for dropped coins, or squinted at distant figures, now linger. They linger on the broadsides nailed to the tavern door, on the printed notices tacked to the butcher's stall. You hear the rustle of cheap paper, the low murmur of lips forming words, and the sudden, delighted gasp of someone understanding something they've never understood before. It's a sonic landscape subtly, yet irrevocably, shifting. No longer is knowledge held exclusively in the hushed cloisters or the gilded libraries of the elite. It's spilling out, seeping into the cobblestones, catching on the wind, landing in the hands of the baker's apprentice, the weaver's daughter, the retired soldier. This isn't just about seeing better, is it? We've journeyed through the murky depths of pre-spectacle life, seen how lenses began as curiosities, then tools for the monastic few, and finally, after Gutenberg's magnificent thunderclap, a vital necessity for an increasingly print-hungry world. But now it's different. The very fabric of society is being rewoven, thread by thread, by the simple, profound act of reading. Imagine, for a moment, a world where the majority of people live their lives without ever deciphering a written word. Their understanding of history, law, religion, and distant lands comes solely from oral tradition, from sermons, from the occasional town crier's shout. Then, almost overnight in historical terms, a cascade of affordable books, pamphlets, and newspapers begins to tumble forth. And suddenly, those once blurred lines become starkly clear, thanks in no small part to the spectacles perched on countless noses. You're living through a quiet revolution, one that, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive without the ability to read a simple warning label on, say, a bottle of medieval snake oil. The impact is seismic. Before this, the notion of public opinion was largely theoretical, a vague consensus whispered from tavern to market. Now, with printed broadsides and pamphlets circulating, people could consume information, form individual thoughts, and even, dare I say it, discuss these thoughts with others who had read the same material. It's the genesis of mass communication, and it's profoundly unsettling for those in power who preferred to control the narrative. Imagine the consternation of a local lord when his peasants, instead of simply nodding, start quoting passages from a recently printed critique of his tax policies. Awkward, very awkward. This literacy explosion wasn't just about people learning to read. It was about the kind of material they were reading. No longer solely biblical texts or dense philosophical tomes, though those certainly flourished. Now you'd find practical manuals on agriculture, guides to local laws, political manifestos, and even, gasp, fictional romances that made even the most stoic merchant blush. The appetite for printed material became insatiable, creating a feedback loop where more readers demanded more books, which in turn drove down costs and increased availability, leading to even more readers. It's a beautiful, self-perpetuating cycle, fueled by the clarity lenses provided. A mainstream historical fact. During the 16th and 17th centuries, while literacy rates varied wildly by region and social class, there was a demonstrable upward trend across Western Europe, often doubling or even tripling in urban centers. This wasn't just confined to men. Women, particularly in Protestant areas where direct biblical engagement was encouraged, also saw a notable, if slower, increase in their ability to read. Suddenly, the domestic sphere became a new locus for learning. You might find a mother reading a primer to her children, or a daughter deciphering a recipe from a printed cookbook. The kitchen, not just the cathedral, was becoming a place of intellectual engagement. Now, for a quirky tidbit, as literacy spread, so did the concept of silent reading. Before the printing press and widespread availability of texts, most reading was done aloud, often in groups. It was a communal, performance-based act. Imagine trying to concentrate on a dense theological text while someone else across the room is loudly sounding out, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." Annoying, right? But with the sudden abundance of reading material and the quiet solitude spectacles often afforded, individuals began to internalize the act of reading. The eye scanned the page, the mind processed the words, and no sound was uttered. This seemingly minor shift had profound psychological implications, fostering deeper personal reflection and individual interpretation, which, ironically, could make you a much more effective rebel. Historians still argue whether the desire for literacy drove the invention and spread of spectacles and the printing press, or whether these technological advancements created the widespread desire for literacy. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, and frankly, a debate that probably makes even the most caffeinated academic want to curl up with a good book and a warm blanket. But what's undeniable is the symbiotic relationship. Spectacles made reading accessible for those with presbyopia. The printing press made texts affordable and abundant. And together, they ignited a societal transformation that continues to reverberate today. This explosion of literacy reshaped everything. It democratized knowledge, empowered individuals, challenged established authorities, and even altered family dynamics as parents could now directly engage with educational materials for their children. It wasn't just about reading. It was about thinking, questioning, and connecting with a wider world that stretched far beyond the confines of your village. Remember how limited horizons were before, like trying to see the entire universe through a keyhole. Well, thanks to the power of print and the magic of Murano glass, that keyhole just became a panoramic window. And the view, absolutely breathtaking. You've learned to navigate the choppy seas of broadsides and pamphlets, squinting through your new lenses at sensational accusations and dubious proclamations. But imagine, now, a subtle yet profound shift in the tide. Those sporadic bursts of information, those isolated islands of print, begin to coalesce into something more regular, more predictable. You wake up, perhaps, in the late 17th century, not just hoping for a new pamphlet to appear, but expecting it. The familiar rustle of paper, the crisp scent of fresh ink, it's becoming part of your morning ritual. This wasn't just a piece of news. This was the news, delivered with an unprecedented, almost comforting regularity. This, my friend, is the advent of the newspaper and the periodical, your daily, weekly, or even bi-weekly dose of print, meticulously folded and often delivered right to your door, or at least to your nearest coffee house. Your spectacles, once the key to unlocking ancient texts and revolutionary manifestos, now became your gateway to the unfolding present, day by day. Though, truth be told, sometimes the unfolding present was just another story about a really big turnip. Think of it, before this, news was often second-hand, unreliable, or delivered by official decree. A town crier might shout out royal proclamations, or a traveler might bring tailies from afar. But now you could hold a tangible, printed account of events in your own hands. This shift from intermittent information to a continuous stream fundamentally altered how people understood the world. No longer were you just reacting to isolated events. You were tracking ongoing narratives, following political debates, and even, gasp, reading about scandalous affairs among the gentry. It was like going from occasionally hearing about a celebrity to having their every move documented in a daily tabloid. Your eyes, aided by those corrective lenses, became accustomed to scanning columns of tightly packed text, sifting through reports from foreign lands, market prices, and even occasional poetry. If you thought sorting truth from propaganda was tough with a single broadside, just wait until you're trying to make sense of a dozen conflicting reports across a week's worth of papers. It's like trying to get a straight answer from a committee of cats. This regular flow of print wasn't just about providing information. It was about shaping opinion. Governments quickly realized the power of a consistent voice in print. In England, for instance, the Oxford Gazette, later the London Gazette, emerged in the mid-17th century, initially published twice a week. It started as an official publication, controlled by the Crown, primarily disseminating official announcements, court circulars, and carefully curated foreign news. You can imagine the king's ministers, probably also sporting some rather grand spectacles, nodding sagely as they approved each edition, ensuring that the public received only the right version of events. This was a direct, institutionalized attempt to guide the public narrative, far more sophisticated than simply commissioning a few pamphlets. It was the daily drip feed of preferred information, subtly nudging public sentiment in a desired direction. Historians still argue whether these early newspapers primarily reflected existing public opinion, or whether their consistent messaging actively molded it over time, creating a new, more unified national consciousness. But it wasn't just government organs. Independent publishers, often risking censorship or worse, also began producing their own regular publications. These might be coffeehouse newsletters, providing political commentary or literary journals offering essays and reviews. The content could be surprisingly varied, and to our modern eyes, quite peculiar. Alongside serious political dispatches, you might find detailed accounts of local oddities, such as a cow giving birth to a two-headed calf. A classic example of early if it bleeds. It leads journalism or long, rambling advertisements for patent medicines that promise to cure everything from gout to a bad mood. You could even find detailed, public notices about lost pets or runaway servants, which in a way were the 17th century equivalent of a very public, very non-private Craigslist. It was a bizarre, fascinating mishmash of information, all bundled together for your consumption, provided your spectacles were up to the task of deciphering the often cramped print. You might even stumble upon an advice column offering pearls of wisdom like, to cure melancholy, simply drink a pint of ale and recite verses about happy lambs. It probably worked about as well as that crocodile dung sunscreen we discussed. This regularity created a new kind of informed, or at least regularly informed, citizenry. Discussions in taverns and coffee houses shifted from mere gossip to debates informed by the latest printed reports. If the London Gazette reported on a new treaty with the Dutch, you and your neighbor could discuss its implications, each having read the same, or at least the officially sanctioned, account. This shared pool of information, even if biased, fostered a sense of collective participation in current events. You were no longer just a passive subject. You were a reader, an interpreter, and perhaps even a commentator on the unfolding drama of your time. Your spectacles didn't just help you see the words, they helped you see yourself as part of a larger, more interconnected world. Yet this power came with strings. Censorship remained a constant threat. Governments and powerful institutions fretted over the unchecked flow of information, particularly critical commentary. Printers and journalists often faced fines, imprisonment, or worse for publishing material deemed seditious or blasphemous. The struggle for press freedom, often a dangerous battle. Authorities understood that what people read, and how often, directly influenced thought and action. For the first time, what people read could be the same at roughly the same time across vast distances. Your reading glasses were, in a very real sense, giving you a shared lens through which to view the contemporary world, albeit one filtered by agendas. The next time you grab your morning paper or glance at your news feed, remember those pioneers with their riveted spectacles, eagerly devouring their daily dose of ink and paper, laying the foundation for our current information overload. Imagine waking up, not with the familiar weight of spectacles on your nose or the subtle blur that tells you it's time to find them. No, you simply open your eyes and the world snaps into perfect, crisp focus. The dust motes dancing in the morning light, the intricate pattern on your ceiling, the distant trees swaying outside your window, all presented with startling clarity, as if your very gaze is a high-definition camera. This isn't some far-off sci-fi fantasy, a gift from benevolent aliens, or even a particularly effective eye cream. This is the everyday reality for millions, a testament to the relentless, often bizarre journey of vision correction that began with those clunky, rivet-bound medieval spectacles. Of course, if you were born, say, 300 years ago with the vision you have now, you probably wouldn't survive this long, let alone read this. You'd be stumbling into wells, mistaking grumpy badgers for fluffy bunnies, and generally having a very blurry, dangerous, and short existence. From those early days, where vision correction was literally a heavy burden perched precariously on your face, The human desire for invisibility and convenience began its quiet revolution. You can trace the conceptual leap back surprisingly far. Even Leonardo da Vinci, in the early 16th century, sketched a concept that involved submerging the eye in a bowl of water to change its optical power. A truly splashy, if impractical, precursor to the contact lens. He also, rather brilliantly, designed a glass model of the cornea that could be placed directly on the eye. Imagine the courage, or perhaps sheer desperation, required to try that out. Just a little piece of glass on your eyeball, what could go wrong? He might have mused, with a mischievous twinkle in his own perfectly corrected eyes. The 19th century really saw the first tangible steps. You're looking at researchers like Sir John Herschel, the British astronomer, who proposed grinding a spherical glass lens to match the shape of the cornea and filling the space with animal jelly. Yes, animal jelly. Not exactly soft lenses material, is it? It makes you wonder how many poor volunteers ended up with sticky, slightly gelatinous eyes. The actual fabrication of the first contact lens, as we know it, happened in the late 1880s, almost simultaneously by a German glassblower named F. Müller and a Swiss ophthalmologist, Adolf Fick. Müller created a protective glass shell to cover an eye that had been damaged, but Fick went further, creating the first true corrective lenses designed to rest on the sclera, the white part of your eye. These were still heavy, made of blown glass, and could only be worn for a few hours. Wearing them was less about comfort and more about enduring a tiny, painful glass dome on your eye. You might as well have strapped a small, transparent tortoise shell to your eyeball. The real breakthrough for mass adoption came with the invention of polymethyl methacrylate, or PMMA, in 1936. This transparent plastic was much lighter and more comfortable than glass. The first plastic contact lenses were developed in 1938 by William Feinblum, an American optometrist. For the first time, you could wear lenses that were not only corrective, but also relatively lightweight and more tolerable. They were still rigid, though, and didn't allow oxygen to reach the cornea, leading to discomfort and potential eye issues if worn for too long. You'd pop them in, see clearly for a bit, then experience that delightful dry, scratchy sensation as your eyes screamed for air. Did you know that early experimental contact lenses were sometimes made from cellulose acetate, a material more commonly associated with film and textiles? Imagine peering through a tiny piece of film, hoping it would correct your vision. It sounds like something out of a bizarre science fair project, not serious ophthalmology. Historians still argue whether the initial drive for contact lenses was primarily aesthetic, to avoid the clunky look of spectacles, or purely functional, to provide better peripheral vision for sports or specific professions. It's a chicken and egg question of vanity versus utility. But even as contact lenses offered newfound freedom, the ultimate dream remained: permanent vision correction without daily intervention. This is where you enter the era of lasers, a technology that feels straight out of a futuristic movie, yet has become incredibly commonplace. The journey to laser eye surgery, specifically LASIK, is a fascinating one, built on layers of scientific understanding. You're looking at a convergence of knowledge about corneal reshaping and the precise power of excimer lasers. The excimer laser, first developed in the 1970s, was initially used in microelectronics to etch circuit boards. It produces a cool, ultraviolet light that can precisely ablate, or remove, microscopic layers of tissue without causing thermal damage to surrounding areas. Think of it like a microscopic, incredibly precise sculptor's tool, but made of light. This was the key. The first successful excimer laser treatment on a human eye to correct vision was performed in 1987 by Dr. Marguerite MacDonald in New Orleans. This was photo-refractive keratectomy, or PRK, a procedure where the outer layer of the cornea is removed before the laser reshapes the underlying tissue. It was effective, but had a longer, more painful recovery time. Imagine peeling back a thin layer of your eye, then zapping it with a laser, then waiting for it to heal. Sounds like a delightful weekend plan, doesn't it? The real game changer, the procedure you're most likely familiar with, is LASIK laser-assisted in situ keratomylosis. This technique was pioneered by Greek ophthalmologist Ioannis Palikaris in 1990. Instead of removing the entire outer layer of the cornea, LASIK involves creating a thin, hinged flap of corneal tissue, lifting it, using the excimer laser to reshape the underlying cornea, and then repositioning the flap. The flap acts as a natural bandage, allowing for much faster healing and less discomfort. It's like performing intricate surgery under a tiny, self-sealing tent. Before lasers, some early attempts at corneal reshaping involved techniques like radial keratotomy, RK, where small incisions were made in the cornea to flatten it. This procedure was developed in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and became popular in the US before LASIK. The idea was to make tiny cuts, like spokes on a wheel, to alter the curvature. You can imagine the precision required and the potential for uneven or unpredictable results. It was a bit like trying to flatten a bouncy castle by poking it with a dozen tiny knives. Effective, perhaps, but certainly not elegant. Historians still argue whether the rapid adoption of RK in the West, despite its inherent risks, highlighted the sheer desperation for spectacle-free vision, or simply a lack of better alternatives at the time. So where do we go from here? You've got contact lenses that can monitor your glucose levels, detect early signs of glaucoma, or even offer augmented reality overlays, essentially turning your eyeball into a tiny, high-tech display screen. Imagine reading emails or navigating through a city, with directions floating subtly in your peripheral vision, all without ever needing to look at a phone. It's like having Google Maps projected directly onto your retina, without the distracting voice telling you to turn left now, while you're trying to enjoy a quiet stroll. And laser technology continues to evolve. You have femtosecond lasers, which create the LASIK flap with incredible precision, and even all-laser procedures like SMILE, small incision lenticule extraction, where a tiny lenticule, a disc of tissue, is created inside the cornea with a laser, and then removed through a tiny incision, eliminating the need for a flap altogether. It's like performing keyhole surgery on your eye, which sounds both terrifying and incredibly impressive. Further down the line, you're looking at genetic therapies to prevent or even reverse certain causes of blindness, implantable lenses that can be adjusted after surgery, and perhaps even entirely bioengineered eyes. The future might see a world where poor vision is not just corrected, but eradicated, a relic of a bygone era, like a rotary phone or an actual paper map. The idea of wearing vision correction might become as quaint as carrying around a quill and inkwell. You might just wake up one day, and your eyes, perfectly formed and flawlessly functional, will be ready to take on the world. No intervention required, no daily routine, just pure, unadulterated clarity. Lasting legacy, a clearer tomorrow. Imagine, just for a moment, that you wake up tomorrow and the world is a blur. Not just a little fuzzy, but a complete, unyielding, impenetrable fog where everything beyond your outstretched hand is a formless suggestion. You try to read a street sign, but it's just squiggles. You try to recognize a friend across the room, but they're an indistinct smudge. You realize with a sudden, chilling certainty that all the crisp, clear detail you take for granted, the vibrant colors, the sharp edges, the tiny print on your cereal box, has vanished. Pretty terrifying, right? And honestly, without the cumulative genius of centuries, that's precisely the world you'd be navigating. In fact, you probably wouldn't even be navigating it for very long, because trying to survive in a complex modern society with untreated severe visual impairment, yeah, you probably won't survive this. Consider that your cheeky reality check for the night. But thankfully, that's not your reality, is it? You stand on the shoulders of giants, peering through the very legacy we've been tracing tonight. From those first clumsy rivets and balances, to the almost invisible contact lenses and corrective surgeries of today, the journey of spectacles has been nothing short of a quiet revolution. You see, the enduring impact isn't just about clearer vision for individuals. It's about the fundamental reshaping of human progress itself. Think back to the monastic scribes, their weary eyes straining over illuminated manuscripts. Remember how spectacles extended their productive years, allowing them to copy and preserve knowledge for generations. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about the very survival of intellectual heritage. Without those early lenses, how much of ancient wisdom, how many classical texts, might have been lost to the irreversible march of time and failing eyesight? It's a mainstream historical fact that the prolonged working life of scholars, enabled by spectacles, played a critical role in the preservation and dissemination of knowledge during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Imagine how many fewer cat memes we'd have today if monks couldn't see to draw their illuminated letters. That's a joke, of course. Then came Gutenberg's press, a truly seismic event. The sheer volume of printed material that suddenly flooded Europe would have been a bottleneck without adequate visual aids. It was no longer just a select few copying texts. It was millions, eventually billions, wanting to read. Spectacles transformed from a niche luxury for the elite to an essential tool for the masses. This fueled a literacy explosion that, in turn, fueled more demand for books, creating a beautiful, self-reinforcing cycle. You could say it was the original killer app for the human eye, making reading universally accessible in a way never before imagined. And the quirky tidbit here? Well, consider that before the widespread use of spectacles, the average age of scholarly productivity was significantly lower. Scholars would literally retire from reading and writing in their late 40s or early 50s due to presbyopia, the age-related hardening of the eye's lens. Spectacles effectively added decades of active intellectual life to countless individuals, effectively extending the human lifespan for cognitive output. It's almost like a subtle, non-surgical form of life extension, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the invention of spectacles or the printing press had a more profound and immediate impact on the acceleration of the Renaissance, a debate that highlights just how intertwined these two innovations became. The scientific revolution, too, owes an immense debt. Kepler, remember him, understanding light and lenses, laying the groundwork for modern optics. Without clear vision, the precise observations necessary for astronomy, microscopy, and countless other scientific fields would have been impossible. You can't discover gravity if you can't read the apple's trajectory, right? Okay, maybe you could, but you get the point. Spectacles weren't just aids. They were enablers, opening up entire new worlds of discovery, from the microscopic wonders of cellular life to the vast expanse of the cosmos. Even today, as we move into the era of contacts and lasers, the core principle remains: extending and enhancing human perception. Think about augmented reality glasses, or even advanced surgical techniques that restore sight. These are all descendants of that first crude piece of shaped glass, all part of the continuous human quest to see more, understand more, and experience more. The humble spectacle, in its myriad forms, has been a silent partner in almost every significant leap of human progress since its inception. It has literally helped us see our way to a clearer tomorrow, both literally and metaphorically. Now, as the echoes of our historical journey begin to softly fade, and the edges of your own vision might be softening with the gentle hush of the approaching night, let's simply rest in the quiet understanding of what we've uncovered. This seemingly small invention, born of necessity and crafted from elemental glass, didn't just correct blurry vision. It meticulously, patiently, and profoundly reshaped the very fabric of human existence. It illuminated minds that might otherwise have been dimmed, allowed stories to be penned that might otherwise have been lost, and revealed truths that might otherwise have remained forever hidden in the shadows of an unmagnified world. The whispers of those early glassmakers, the careful clinking of tools in Murano, the hurried rustle of pages in a monk's cell, they all coalesce into a gentle symphony of progress. This grand narrative of sight and knowledge, stretching across centuries, is a testament to our ingenuity, our ceaseless curiosity, and our quiet, persistent drive to overcome limitations. So, as you drift towards the realm of dreams, take with you this comforting thought: that even the most seemingly simple innovations can blossom into something of immeasurable consequence, quietly guiding humanity towards ever clearer horizons. Rest now with the understanding that the world you perceive, in all its vivid detail, is a gift, nurtured and preserved through the foresight of those who learn to shape light. Let the soft darkness embrace you, allowing your own inner world to come into peaceful focus. Sweet dreams,